The mountain village of Cedar Ridge had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, the small community of barely 300 souls lived by unwritten rules that had been passed down for generations. Among these rules was one that stood above all others. When someone died, the whole village came together to help lay them to rest. Sarah Mitchell had lived in Cedar Ridge her entire 28 years. She had married young, to a man named Tom who worked the lumber mill on the edge of town. Their little house sat on Maple Street, painted yellow with white shutters that Sarah tended to with great care. She had always dreamed of filling that house with children, and when little Emma was born 3 years ago, it seemed like all her prayers had been answered. Emma was the kind of child who lit up every room she entered. With her mother's bright blue eyes and her father's thick brown curls, she had a smile that could melt the hardest heart in the village. She would run through the streets with her arms spread wide, pretending to be a bird, calling out greetings to every neighbor she passed. Old Mrs. Peterson at the general store always kept a jar of peppermint sticks, just for Emma, and the postman, Charlie, would save interesting stamps from distant places to show her. The Ridge Man, as everyone called him, was perhaps the most important person in Cedar Ridge, though he held no official title. His real name was Samuel Hendricks, but folks had called him the Ridge Man for so long that many of the younger residents didn't even know his given name. He was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with silver hair that caught the sunlight and hands that bore the calluses of decades of hard work. Samuel owned the largest plot of land in the area, including the cemetery that sat on a peaceful hill overlooking the village. Samuel's family had been the keepers of the Cedar Ridge Cemetery for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had established the burial ground back in 1847, and since then, every Hendricks man had taken on the responsibility of maintaining the sacred space and making the final decisions about who could be laid to rest there. The cemetery was more than just a business to Samuel. It was a sacred trust that connected him to his ancestors and to every family in the village who had ever lost someone they loved. The autumn of 1952 had been particularly harsh. The leaves turned early, and by October, a bitter wind was already howling down from the mountains, carrying with it the promise of a long, difficult winter. It was during this time that little Emma began to show the first signs of illness. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a common cold. She had a slight fever and complained that her throat hurt when she swallowed. Sarah gave her honey and warm milk, the same remedies her own mother had used when she was sick as a child. But Emma didn't get better. Instead, she grew worse with each passing day. The fever climbed higher, and she began to have trouble breathing. Her once bright eyes became glassy and unfocused, and she barely had the energy to lift her head from her pillow. Tom hitched up their old wagon and drove through the night to fetch Dr. Morrison from the county seat, 30 miles away. The doctor was a kind man with gentle hands, but when he examined Emma, his face grew grave. "I'm afraid it's pneumonia," Dr. Morrison told Sarah and Tom quietly, speaking just outside Emma's bedroom door. "In a child this young, and with the infection as advanced as it is, I won't lie to you about her chances. Keep her warm, give her plenty of fluids, and pray. That's about all we can do now." The word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. In a small community, everyone shared in each other's joys and sorrows, and the news of Emma's illness struck the village like a physical blow. Neighbors began arriving at the Mitchell house with covered dishes and offers to help. Mrs. Peterson closed her store early each day to sit with Emma so Sarah could rest. The pastor, Father McKinnon, came by every evening to say prayers over the little girl's bed. For 5 days, Emma fought the illness with everything she had. Sometimes, her fever would break for a few hours, and she would seem almost like her old self, asking for water or whispering to her favorite doll. During these moments, hope would bloom in Sarah's heart like a flower after rain. But then the fever would return, higher than before, and Emma would slip back into the restless sleep that seemed to pull her further and further away from the world she had loved so much. On the morning of the sixth day, as the first snow of winter began to fall outside the windows, Emma's breathing became shallow and labored. Sarah sat beside the bed, holding her daughter's small hand and singing the lullabies that had always brought comfort. Tom stood at the window, his shoulders shaking with grief he was trying to hold inside. At precisely 11:47 in the morning, little Emma took her last breath as peacefully as if she were simply drifting off to sleep. The silence that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It was as if the whole world had suddenly stopped turning. The clock on the mantel continued to tick, and the wind still rattled the windows, but everything felt hollow and distant, as though she were hearing these sounds from the bottom of a deep well. She continued to hold Emma's hand long after it had grown cold, unwilling to let go of the last physical connection she had to her daughter. Word of Emma's passing spread through the village within hours. By evening, the Mitchell house was filled with neighbors who had come to offer their condolences and their help. The women bustled about the kitchen, preparing food and making arrangements, while the men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the tragedy of losing one so young. Through it all, Sarah sat beside Emma's bed, barely acknowledging the people who came and went. It was Mrs. Peterson who finally approached Sarah about the arrangements that would need to be made. She sat down gently beside the grieving mother and took her hand. "Sarah, dear," she said softly, "we need to talk about laying Emma to rest. Have you thought about what you'd like to do?" Sarah looked up with eyes that seemed to see nothing. "I want her buried in Cedar Ridge Cemetery," she whispered, "on the hill where she can look down over the village. She loved this place so much. She loved everyone here." Mrs. Peterson's expression grew troubled. "Sarah, you know that's the Ridge man's decision to make. Samuel Hendricks decides who can be buried there, and, well, he has his rules." The rules, Mrs. Peterson was referring to were well known throughout the village, though they were rarely spoken of directly. Samuel Hendricks maintained strict standards for who could be laid to rest in Cedar Ridge Cemetery. The burial ground was reserved for those who had been born in the village or who had lived there for at least 25 years. It was also understood that only those who had contributed significantly to the community, who had proven their worth through years of hard work and good citizenship, would be granted a place in the sacred ground. These rules had been established by Samuel's great-grandfather and had been strictly enforced ever since. The cemetery was seen as hallowed ground, reserved for the pillars of the community, the people who had helped build Cedar Ridge into what it was. While Emma had certainly been loved by everyone in the village, she was only 3 years old. By the traditional standards, she had not yet earned her place among the honored dead. The next morning brought a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the entire village. Tom Mitchell walked slowly up the winding path that led to Samuel Hendricks' farmhouse, his feet heavy with dread. He had volunteered to make the request himself, hoping to spare Sarah the additional pain of possible rejection. The farmhouse sat on a rise overlooking the cemetery, a sturdy 2-story structure built from local stone and timber. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Tom could see Samuel through the kitchen window, sitting at his table with a cup of coffee. Samuel answered the door before Tom could even knock. He was a man who had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was coming to see him, especially when they came bearing sad news. His weathered face showed the weight of years spent making difficult decisions, and his eyes held a kindness tempered by the wisdom that came from understanding the importance of tradition. "Tom," Samuel said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter, "I heard about Emma. I'm truly sorry for your loss. She was a special little girl." Tom stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "Thank you, Samuel. That means a lot coming from you." He paused, gathering his courage. "I've come to ask you something. Sarah wants Emma buried in the cemetery, up on the hill where she can watch over the village." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Tom could see something flicker in the older man's eyes. "You know the rules, Tom. The cemetery is for those who have earned their place through years of service to the community. Emma was just a child." "I know the rules," Tom said, his voice breaking slightly. "But She was our daughter, Samuel. She was part of this community. Everyone loved her. Samuel walked to the window and gazed out at the cemetery, its headstones barely visible through the morning mist. The rules exist for a reason, Tom. My great-grandfather established them to ensure that the cemetery remained a place of honor, reserved for those who had truly contributed to the life of this village. If I start making exceptions, where does it end? Tom felt his heart sinking. He had expected this response, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel final and crushing. What am I supposed to tell Sarah? She's already lost her daughter. Now you're going to deny her the one thing that might bring her some peace. I'm not trying to cause more pain, Samuel said, turning back to face Tom. There are other places. The county cemetery is only 15 miles away. Many good families have their loved ones there. But Tom was already shaking his head. You don't understand. Emma belongs here. This village was her whole world. Every person here knew her name, watched her grow up. She brought joy to everyone she met. Doesn't that count for something? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Bring Sarah to me, he said finally. If she wants to make this request herself, I'll listen to what she has to say. That afternoon, a small group gathered at the cemetery gates. Word had somehow spread through the village that Sarah Mitchell was going to ask the Ridge man to bury Emma in the hallowed ground, and people had begun arriving quietly to show their support. There was Mrs. Peterson from the general store, Father McKinnon with his worn Bible tucked under his arm, Charlie the postman, and nearly 24 other villagers who had known and loved little Emma. Samuel stood near the cemetery entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray sky. He had changed from his work clothes into his best suit, a sign of respect for the gravity of the moment. His face was solemn, but not unkind, and those who knew him could see that this decision weighed heavily on his mind. Sarah approached slowly, supported by Tom on one side and her sister Margaret on the other. The grief of the past week had taken a visible toll on her. Her face was pale and drawn, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared into the depths of unimaginable loss. She wore a simple black dress that she had borrowed from Margaret, as she owned nothing appropriate for such a solemn occasion. The crowd that had gathered fell silent as Sarah approached the Ridgeman. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if nature itself understood the importance of this moment. Sarah stopped a few feet from Samuel and looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and desperation. Mr. Hendricks, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've come to ask you something that I know goes against your family's traditions. Samuel nodded gravely. I'm listening, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah's composure began to crumble almost immediately. My Emma is gone, she said, her voice catching on each word. My beautiful little girl who loved this place and everyone in it. She used to tell me that when she grew up, she wanted to take care of the whole village, just like you take care of the cemetery. She said she wanted to make sure everyone was happy and safe. Tears began to flow down Sarah's cheeks, but she continued speaking. I know she was only 3 years old. I know she didn't have time to contribute to the community the way your rules require. But she did contribute, Mr. Hendricks. She brought light into the lives of everyone she met. Ask anyone here. Ask Mrs. Peterson how Emma's smile brightened her days at the store. Ask Charlie how excited she got when he showed her stamps from faraway places. Ask Father McKinnon how she would sit so quietly during services, even though she was just a baby. The crowd murmured in agreement, and several people nodded their heads. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward slightly, as if to offer her own testimony to Emma's impact on the community. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. I'm not asking you to break your rules lightly. I understand that this cemetery is sacred ground, reserved for those who have earned their place through a lifetime of service. But Emma's lifetime was cut short through no fault of her own. She didn't have the chance to grow up and contribute the way adults do, but in her 3 short years, she touched more lives than some people do in 80. Samuel's expression remained impassive, but those watching closely could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. He had spent his entire adult life upholding the traditions that his family had established, and The weight of that responsibility had shaped every decision he had ever made regarding the cemetery. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I understand your pain, and I don't want to add to it. But the rules exist for important reasons. If I allow Emma to be buried here, what happens the next time someone loses a child? What happens when someone wants to bury their beloved dog or their grandfather who only lived here for 10 years instead of 25? Where do I draw the line?" Sarah's tears came faster now, and her voice rose with desperation. "Please," she said, the word coming out as almost a sob. "I'm not asking you to change the rules for everyone. I'm asking you to have mercy in this one case. Emma was special. Everyone here will tell you that." The crowd began to murmur more loudly, with several voices calling out in agreement. "She was special," called out Mrs. Peterson. "That little girl brought joy to this whole village." Charlie the postman nodded vigorously and added, "She was one of us, Mr. Hendricks. Born and raised here just like the rest of us." Samuel raised his hand for silence, and the crowd immediately quieted. The power of his position in the community was evident in the way everyone deferred to his authority, even in their grief and frustration. Sarah took a step closer to Samuel, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, her voice now trembling with emotion, "I'm begging you. I'm asking you as a mother who has lost her only child, as a member of this community who has always respected your family's authority. Please, I'm asking you." Her voice broke completely, and she struggled to get the words out through her tears. "Bury my young one." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Everyone present seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the Ridge man's response. Samuel stood perfectly still, his gaze moving from Sarah's tear-stained face to the faces of the villagers who had gathered to support her. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one spoke, no one moved. Finally, Samuel's voice cut through the silence, and when he spoke, his words seemed to freeze the very air around them. The weight of his decision, whatever it would be, hung in the balance, and everyone present understood that this moment would be remembered and talked about for generations to come. The fate of little Emma's final resting place, and perhaps the future of the cemetery's traditions, rested in the hands of one man whose word had always been final in matters of life and death in Cedar Ridge. Samuel Hendricks stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his eyes closed as if he were wrestling with forces that went far beyond the simple question of where to bury a child. When he finally opened his eyes, they held a depth of emotion that few people had ever seen in the stoic Ridgeman. His voice, when it came, was barely audible, but carried with absolute authority. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said slowly, "there are times in life when the letter of the law must bow to the spirit of mercy. Your Emma will be buried in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, on the hill where she can watch over the village she loved so much." The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, sobs, and whispered prayers of gratitude. Sarah's legs gave out beneath her, and Tom caught her as she collapsed in relief. Through her tears, she looked up at Samuel with an expression of pure gratitude that would be etched in his memory forever. But Samuel wasn't finished speaking. He raised his hand again for silence, and his next words carried even more weight than his decision to allow the burial. "However," he continued, "I want everyone here to understand what this means. I'm not changing the rules for the cemetery. I am making an exception for a child who, in her brief life, embodied everything that makes this community worth preserving. Emma's grave will serve as a reminder to all of us that sometimes the most important contributions to a community cannot be measured in years of service or grand accomplishments, but in the simple act of bringing joy and love to those around us." Father McKinnon stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Samuel, this is the right decision. The Lord himself said, 'Suffer little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven.'" Samuel nodded respectfully to the pastor. "The burial will take place tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I will prepare the grave myself, and I ask that the entire community join us in laying Emma to rest with the honor and dignity she deserves. That evening, as word of Samuel's decision spread throughout Cedar Ridge, something remarkable began to happen. People started arriving at the Mitchell house with more than just food and condolences. Old Mr. Jameson, who ran the woodworking shop, appeared at the door carrying a small, beautifully crafted wooden coffin. He had worked through the night to create something worthy of the little girl who had always stopped to watch him work through his shop window. Mrs. Henderson and her daughters arrived with armloads of wildflowers that they had gathered from the meadows surrounding the village. Emma always loved flowers, Mrs. Henderson explained to Sarah. She used to pick dandelions and bring them to me, saying they were as pretty as roses. I thought she should be surrounded by all the flowers she loved. Charlie the postman came by with a special delivery, a collection of the most beautiful stamps from his personal collection, which he wanted to place in Emma's coffin. She was always so excited about the places these stamps came from, he said quietly. Maybe now she can visit all those places herself. As the night wore on, the Mitchell house filled with neighbors who had come not just to mourn, but to celebrate the life of a little girl who had touched them all. Stories were shared about Emma's kindness, her laughter, and the way she had of making even the gloomiest day seem brighter. Mrs. Peterson told about how Emma used to help stock the shelves at the general store, carefully arranging the penny candy while humming to herself. The pastor spoke about how Emma would always try to sing along with the hymns during church services, her small voice adding its own innocent harmony to the congregation's voices. The next afternoon, the entire population of Cedar Ridge gathered on the hill overlooking the village. Samuel had chosen a spot near the top of the cemetery, under an old oak tree whose branches provided a natural canopy. From this location, the view stretched out over the entire valley, encompassing the small houses, the church steeple, and the winding creek that ran through the heart of the community. Samuel had spent the morning preparing not just the grave, but a small ceremony that would honor Emma's memory in a way that no one expected. As the crowd gathered, they noticed that he had placed a small wooden bench beside the gravesite. Carved into the back of the bench were the words, "Emma's place, where love lives on." This bench, Samuel announced to the assembled villagers, will remain here as a permanent reminder of what Emma taught us about community. Anyone who needs a quiet place to think, to pray, or to remember loved ones will always be welcome to sit here. Emma's resting place will not just be a grave, but a place where the living can come to remember what truly matters in life. The service itself was unlike any funeral that Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Instead of focusing on death and loss, Father McKinnon spoke about the gift that Emma's life had been to the community. Children from the village sang songs that Emma had loved, and several adults shared memories of how she had impacted their lives. Mrs. Peterson read a letter that she had written to Emma, thanking her for all the smiles and joy she had brought to the general store. When it came time to lower the small coffin into the ground, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the typical solemnity of a burial, the ceremony took on an almost celebratory atmosphere. People began to share more stories, to laugh through their tears as they remembered Emma's mischievous grin and her boundless energy. It was as if the community had collectively decided that this funeral would reflect Emma's life rather than her death. Samuel himself delivered the final words over Emma's grave. Standing tall against the autumn sky, he spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the hillside. We gather here today not just to bury a child, but to celebrate a life that reminded us all of what it means to be truly alive. Emma Mitchell lived only 3 years, but she packed more joy, more love, and more community spirit into those 3 years than many people manage in a lifetime. He paused, looking out over the faces of the villagers who had gathered to pay their respects. Today, I have learned something important about the rules that have governed this cemetery for generations. Rules are important, and traditions matter, but they must never become more important than the human spirit they are meant to protect. Emma's presence in this sacred ground will not diminish its honor. It will enhance it. As the first shovelful of earth fell onto the small coffin, Sarah Mitchell stepped forward and placed a single dandelion on the grave. It was the same type of flower that Emma used to pick and give to neighbors, declaring them to be the most beautiful flowers in the world. One by one, other villagers came forward to place their own flowers, small toys, or personal mementos that reminded them of Emma. In the weeks that followed, Emma's grave became exactly what Samuel had envisioned, a place where the living came to remember what truly mattered. The bench beside her resting place was rarely empty. Parents brought their children there to teach them about kindness and community. Elderly residents came to sit quietly and remember their own loved ones. Young couples planning their futures came to think about the kind of legacy they wanted to leave behind. The impact of Samuel's decision extended far beyond the immediate community of Cedar Ridge. Word of the Ridgeman's mercy spread to neighboring towns, and people began to talk about the cemetery on the hill where a little girl's grave had changed the way an entire community thought about life and death. Some criticized Samuel for breaking with tradition, but far more praised him for recognizing that true wisdom sometimes requires the courage to set aside rigid rules in favor of compassion. Samuel himself seemed changed by the experience. While he continued to maintain the high standards for burial in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, he also established a special section of the cemetery for children who died young. He called it Emma's Garden and declared that any child from the community who died before their 5th birthday would automatically be granted a place there, regardless of how long their family had lived in the village. Years later, when Samuel Hendricks passed away at the age of 78, he was buried just a few feet from Emma's grave under the same oak tree. His own headstone bore a simple inscription. He learned that mercy is the highest form of wisdom. According to his final wishes, the cemetery's rules were officially amended to include what became known as Emma's Law, a provision that allowed for exceptions to be made in cases where rigid adherence to tradition would cause unnecessary suffering. The story of the little girl who changed the heart of the Ridge man became a legend in the valley. Parents told it to their children as a lesson about the power of love and community. Visitors to Cedar Ridge Cemetery always made sure to visit Emma's grave and sit on the bench where countless people had found comfort and peace. The dandelions that grew wild around her resting place were never removed, as they had become a symbol of the simple, pure joy that Emma had brought to the world. Sarah and Tom Mitchell eventually had 2 more children, both of whom grew up hearing stories about their sister Emma and the impact she had on their community. They learned to tend Emma's grave with love and pride, understanding that their sister had become part of something much larger than themselves, a story of compassion that would be told for generations. The bench beside Emma's grave still stands today, weathered by time, but sturdy and welcoming. The words carved into its back have become a motto for the entire community, where love lives on. And on quiet afternoons, when the wind whispers through the oak tree's branches, visitors sometimes say they can hear the faint sound of a little girl's laughter, reminding everyone who passes by that the most important things in life cannot be measured by rules or traditions, but by the love we show to one another.